We expect to be treated fairly and aim to treat others fairly. But are we programmed to favor those we are close to? Joining us now with more on our expectations for behavior versus our nature. In Chicago, Illinois, Stephen Asma. He is author of Against Fairness. And as we welcome you to the broadcaster, Professor, we want to mention that our online producer, Naveen Vaswani, is currently hosting a Twitter chat right now asking the question, are we too egalitarian for our own good? So we ask those of you watching us online or on TV, chime in with your thoughts and use the hashtag AgendaTVO. Okay, Stephen, you've written a book opposing one of the few remaining ideas in this polarized world that one would have thought everybody could have gotten behind. How come?
Yeah, like everyone else, I was raised on a steady diet of egalitarian values, and we're all sort of told that this is the ethical way. But I had this sort of gripping experience when I became a father. I was on a panel with some other philosophers. One was a revolutionary communist on one side, and I had a Catholic priest on the other. And everyone was sort of promoting the idea that the true ethical way would be equality for all, unbiased, impartiality. That's the true ethical way. And I realized at some point while we were talking that I would probably choke them all to death if it meant somehow that it would extend my son's life, you know, in some science fiction experiment. This is what philosophers do. We invent these scenarios. And I realized I had very deep bonds and feelings and a sense of devotion towards my family that could not be squared with egalitarianism. And that sort of set me off on this path of examining, is there a way to be ethical and still be favorite, sort of enact favoritism and sort of biased partiality?
Well, picking up on that example of I don't know if you've talked about this with your son. How old is your son, I guess I should ask now?
He's 9.
He's 9. So does he know his father is a potential murderer in his best interest, of course?
Yeah, I think he's okay with that. I mean, I think every parent has that emotion, and so I'm sure everybody can relate to that feeling. What I noticed, though, was that there's a sort of a next step, which is there's a kind of ethics of family filial piety or family devotion, and we don't know how to express this. We have concepts like loyalty, but we don't ordinarily recognize those as part of the larger social ethic. So there was a wonderful story that Confucius tells where he goes out to an outlying province and the local mayor comes to meet him and wants to impress him, and he says, hey, we're so virtuous here that if a father steals a sheep, the son will actually give evidence against him in a court of law. And Confucius responds to this by saying, actually, where I come from, the son shields the father and the father shields the son. There's virtue in that too. So that's the sort of area I wanted to explore in the book.
So what would you call the ethical principle that trumps fairness, as you have just sort of described it with those anecdotes?
Well, I would say the sort of felt experience is one we recognize as love. But I would say in the sort of realm of virtue ethics, I also identify these things as loyalty, generosity. I think we have special duties towards our family that make it impossible to reconcile with the larger social contract philosophy, which is the idea that we should be maximizing the greatest good for the greatest number. That's sort of sometimes in professional fields that's called utilitarianism. Mm-hmm. And I think many of us have embraced this as social ethics. But I can't square my love for my children or my siblings or my parents with the idea that everyone deserves equal treatment from me. I'm going to give preferential treatment, and just because I do so doesn't mean I'm selfish. It actually requires a great deal of selfless activity on the part of the family member.
Let me ask you about that Pixar movie Toy Story, which you write about in your book, and you suggested, I think, that it reveals more depth about favoritism than most official ethical instructions to kids. How so?
Right. Well, if you remember the storyline, basically is that there's a human boy and he has these toys, but he doesn't love them all equally. He has favorites, and the main storyline is that a competitor arrives on the scene, namely Buzz Lightyear, and the main toy is threatened by this, and they have to work out who loves who and what the sort of complex hierarchy of affection is. But the film actually does it in a fairly mature way. It doesn't have this denouement at the end where the boy realizes that he loves everyone equally. That doesn't happen. What happens is that the toys, sort of which symbolize family members in a way, realize that they're all sort of loved in different ways and at different levels, and everybody sort of makes their peace with this. And this is, I think, is a much more mature way to think about ethics, which is heavily biased and preferential all over the map.
Here's a quote from your book. Kids learn early on that an honest declaration of, "I'm not getting what I want," holds little persuasion for parents. So they quickly learn to mask their egocentric frustrations with the language of fairness. An appeal to an objective standard of fairness will at least buy some bargaining time for further negotiations. This is not entirely duplicitous on the part of the child, you write, who is often legitimately confused and cannot easily distinguish his private sufferings from larger and more objective social imbalances. This kind of appeal to fairness is not only limited to children, and I wonder whether there are demands for fairness excuses for something else.
Yeah, I think every parent has heard the F word, fairness, 100 times.
I've heard the other one too numerous times, but that's another story.
Right. That's right. But even as adults, what we do is we mask our own sense of envy and our emotional dissatisfactions with the language of fairness. So in our culture, it's become common to sort of, if we feel like we're not getting enough, or we're not as high up as someone else in society, we cry unfair. And Alexis de Tocqueville, the French philosopher, noticed that the American ethos was such that fairness was used as a kind of a way to sort of pummel people into making sure that everyone was unoffended and everyone had a sort of equal status. No one had more than me. And I'm sort of isolating this as well. We act as if we're very principled and egalitarian, but usually when we cry unfair, it's when we feel like we should have something that someone else has. That doesn't make it wrong necessarily, but I'm trying to isolate what the emotional underbelly is to some of these more high-minded principles.
Well, you really do go after the sacred cows, not just fairness, but you also take a poke at Mahatma Gandhi at one point in your book. How come?
Right. Well, in Gandhi's autobiography, he actually says that you should not love anyone too much. No specific person should get your attention because this is biased and preferential. And if you're biased and preferential, you won't be able to love all of humanity equally. So he advises against forming strong bonds. And I agree with George Orwell, who, when he read this in Gandhi's autobiography, he was highly disturbed. And I agree that I think Gandhi has missed something crucial about being human, which is that it's these strong bonds which you are perhaps willing to kill and die for, to put it in the most extreme form. These are the things that make us human. This makes the meaningful life. And if we try to sort of pound that out of our lives, what's left is this kind of ethical bureaucracy, kind of ethics for accountants.
Okay, I've got 4 others who are waiting patiently here in the studio to have at you, as it were, but I want to do one more thing just before we invite everybody else to join the discussion, and that is this. Your thoughts about fairness, I gather, were affected by a trip to Asia that you took, and the differences you saw between the way Chinese and Americans approach this question of fairness. Tell us about that, if you would.
Yeah, that's right. I lived in Shanghai for a while and felt like I have some sort of connection with Chinese culture. My son is half Chinese. It's interesting. Chinese culture is not based on egalitarianism. It's not based on fairness. It's based on the Confucian ideas that are very hierarchical. But a lot of people don't understand that the really good ethical person, the moral person in Chinese culture, is the good family member. So all ethics stems out in concentric circles from the family. And where you are in the family, whether you're the firstborn son or the second or the firstborn daughter, whether you're the father or the mother, it really matters, and it changes what your duties and obligations are. If you're a good son or a good daughter, then you'll actually go out into civic society and be a better person. So ethics is based on this very particular family dynamic, and then you slowly take that out into larger circles. And so you can see it all over China.
Okay. Stephen Asma, thanks for setting the table. We're going to broaden our discussion in just a moment. First, let's have a listen to how others define fairness. Watch.
When you are not treated fairly, it doesn't feel right. It can hurt. It's something that stays with you, and it's something that will affect whatever you do in the future.
Being fair really is doing the right thing.
It's treating everyone as an individual.
And treating everybody the same.
It isn't a piece of paper somewhere that says this is what's fair. It's what the people around the table think is fair.
Can my vision of fairness be different to somebody else's? Yes.
Okay, can we truly expect to be fair if our nature is telling us not to be? Joining us now for more on that, political scientist Sylvia Bashevkin, philosopher Joseph Heath, political theorist Clifford Orwin, psychologist Jordan Peterson, and we welcome back author Stephen Asma in Chicago, Illinois. It's great to have the pride of the University of Toronto around this table here in our studios today, joining Stephen Asma in Chicago for our discussion. All right, let's get to this. Clifford Orwin, you first. Do you think Stephen Asma is right in saying that we exaggerate the importance of fairness towards all? There's that famous Orwin pause again, which we've seen here before. Yes.
I agree with most of what Mr. Asma has said so far in his conversation with you. I do have a question for him, though. I've always regarded as somehow puzzling that Confucian societies have such high levels of corruption. But reading your book has enabled me to understand much better why Confucian societies have such high levels of corruption. It's because favoritism prevails over fairness in those societies. And doesn't that point to a certain problem with favoritism?
Huh. Is that a hole in the argument, Stephen?
I think if you could show that there was much higher levels of corruption in China than elsewhere, I think that would be a powerful argument. My own view is that that's not entirely true. That's definitely how it looks to us from the West. But if you look at more objective social science measures of corruption, you'll find that China does not come off a whole lot worse than other Western democracies. If you look, for example, at the Gini coefficient, which measures disparity of wealth, there you see that China and the U.S., which, very different, obviously, politically and socially, the levels of disparity in wealth and inequality there are about the same, which I think is surprising to many Westerners. Also, it's not clear that democracies produce less corruption. Again, I think this might be a bit of a biased view.
Or maybe wishful thinking on our part. Joe, you've spent time in Asia, Joe, have you not?
I have, actually. And I had a similar thought that Cliff had, which is that although I'm sympathetic to a lot of what Stephen says in the book, I do think he has a tendency to look at the positive benefits that come from partiality and ignore all the downside of partiality. And so in the time I've spent in Asia also, and like Stephen, I have a Chinese mother-in-law and a half Chinese 9-year-old. I mean, we've lived the same life. But my experiences of Asia, though, are that I can see the upside and the downside. So the strong family attachments is very attractive. But I mean, just let me give you a story of just a small example of it. I mean, one of the things I was really surprised by in Hong Kong is that often in tall buildings, there will be a sign in the lobby that says, it is prohibited to throw garbage off of your balcony.
Makes sense.
And, yeah, right. Because it's actually a real problem in Hong Kong, which is that people will often be on the 30th floor of an apartment building, and they'll just throw the garbage off the balcony. And someone was injured once because someone threw like a large household appliance off of a balcony. Now, what's striking is that you don't have to have those signs in North America because most people, it simply wouldn't occur to them to throw garbage off of a large balcony. And that has something to do with a slightly more universalistic ethic. So if you're thinking about obligations in terms of an expanding circle, and you've got your garbage, and you're thinking of throwing it off the balcony, you might think, well, what are the chances one of my cousins is go down there? Of course, the way they solve the problem is by having massive fines for that kind of behavior. So there is a connection between authoritarianism and the extent to which the state has to impose punishments upon people, and the extent to which people themselves just kind of internally and automatically take into consideration other people's interests.
Sylvia, where are you coming from on this?
Well, I'm unsettled, in part quite disturbed by the argument that Stephen Asma made that we sometimes mask envy, with the language of fairness. Because, of course, that can be construed as suggesting there is no such real thing as discrimination in this world, and that this is just all a lot of hot air for what the Brits call whiners, which I think is very dangerous. I think the argument can be construed as kind of the conceit of the privileged. A white male professor in North America of a particular age, a particular educational background, can offer a critique of fairness, I also think that there's a difficulty in sort of looking at the great men of political philosophy and neglecting that there is a huge literature in the field of the ethic of care, full of all kinds of women political philosophers. I think of Joan Trontos, Selma Sevenhuisen, and others who've written at length about this, about the limitations of the sort of rational male actor approach to ethics, and have written at length about social trust, the importance of the family, compassion, generosity, humility, and many of the other values that Stephen Asma celebrates in the book. So I think we need to sort of be cautious about where this argument takes us and who expresses it.
Okay, Sylvia, you were unquestionably far more critical than your two previous speakers about what Stephen Asma had to say. So I think, in fairness, I better give him a shot to respond to that first. Stephen, you want to come back at that?
Well, I think Sylvia raises really important points. Taking her second point first, I agree and try to acknowledge that feminist tradition of care ethics in the book. Sort of near the end of the book, I basically say we need to resuscitate this, and it hasn't gotten enough attention. Philosophers like Carol Gilligan have argued that we've had a view of ethics that is basically a social contract, which is cost-benefit analysis, and we haven't thought enough about the family and emotions like care, and we need to get that back into ethics. So I'm very much in favor of that. As regards her first point, I don't take the view that there's no such thing as discrimination. Of course, there is legitimate discrimination. It has to be fought. My argument in the book is that preferential tribes, and I'm using tribes in the most generic sense here, are not always sort of prejudicial and negative. In fact, I look at Mexican-American tribalism, which is, and I'm using that term generally here, which is basically in-group favoritism. And it serves Mexican-Americans beautifully that there's a tremendous amount of devotion to the in-group as they move resources across the border from Mexico to the United States. It's very much a favoritistic tribal connection that benefits the immigrant group. And you see this in American history over and over again, that immigrant groups are very favoritistic, if I can coin a phrase here, in-group solidarity systems. And in that sense, I'm trying to praise those positive aspects of favoritism as well.
Jordan, we'd like to have you on this program because you get inside people's heads and you can explain what goes on inside people's heads. And I would have thought that empathy with strangers would be pretty high on the list of desirable human values. Is it not?
Well, it's pretty high on the list, but you know, one of the things I find surprising about this debate, especially because in some ways it's being conducted by philosophers, is that fairness is not a word that has a unidimensional meaning. I mean, there's fairness in terms of reciprocity, you know, and a lot of familial relationships and contractual relationships are based on reciprocity. So I do something good for you, and I know that you'll do something good for me, and it's a negotiated balance. And that's even a very important element of something like friendship, even deep friendship. And then there's the fairness element that's justice. You know, it's fair if you get what you deserve. And so that might be a fairness that would be associated with the value of labor. You know, if you work to do something and you produce something, then you deserve the benefits from it. And then there's the fairness that doesn't leave anybody behind. And those are by no means the same thing. Like, in fact, you can't even measure them the same way, and they're not even associated with the same basic human traits. And so part of the problem with the discussion of fairness is, well, just exactly what are we talking about? So are we talking, for example, about mercy or justice, which are by no means the same thing?
All right, let's go back to Chicago. We've got 3 or 4 different definitions of fairness working there. You want to hone in on one of them?
Yeah, I'll even add a little more too. I agree that there's a lot of ambiguity with the term, and this is partly why I think it's actually an anemic concept. We need a more full-blooded notion of social justice to solve our problems. If you look at how the left sees fairness, it tends to see it as an equality issue, either an equality of opportunities or an equality of outcomes. If you look at the right tends to see it as a meritocracy issue. What's fair is that the winner gets the rewards, gets the spoils. And these two notions of fair literally, in some cases, just cancel each other out. So we're often talking at cross purposes. in addition to that, I simply want to argue in the book that there's a notion of favoritism and bias that actually sort of flies in the face of many of these notions of fairness, both the right and the left. If I privilege my loved ones, I'm not giving them what they deserve. You know, oftentimes in our friendships, in our love relationships, we're giving people way more than they deserve. And thank God, that's what's great about favoritism, and we get that in return. So in that sense, I think he's right. Fairness is a confused concept, and I think in many cases it's trotted out as the solution when it only introduces more ambiguity.
Jordan.
Well, there's a technical issue too here. So just because something works at one level of analysis doesn't mean it works at the next, right? So for example, what might be appropriate in a small group isn't necessarily appropriate in a large group. And part of that is necessary ignorance. Like, it's possible that I can tell how to help my family members, but it's not clear that I can tell how to aid Africa. Because I just don't know enough about Africa to aid Africa, and it's highly probable that because I don't know enough, my attempts to aid them are not going to result in anything positive.
And you don't feel any obligation necessary to treat both the same.
Well, I don't feel any obligation to help when I don't know if what I'm doing is going to make it better or worse.
Sure.
And lots of times when people try to do something good, it makes things worse.
Right.
So I don't think you have the same level of knowledge at every level of analysis, and that's partly why you have to concentrate on what's local to you. It's inevitable that you have to concentrate on what's local to you.
They say all politics is local, and maybe, Clifford, we have this happening here as well. Is that right?
Sure.
What, you want to help us out on, how about this? Fairness versus equality. Is that a distinction that's important to make here?
Fairness has become such a wiggle word, right? Very much affected by Rawls's argument for justice as fairness. But, you know, fairness, one could say, fairness acknowledges a certain preference for one's own, right? It's only fair to grant people, parents, a preference for their children and so on. But, you know, I'm inclined to wonder whether, Stephen, whether the bark of your book isn't worse than its bite. You know, I've always thought of the communitarian liberal debate that if you scratch a communitarian, you find a liberal. And in your case, where you've actually described yourself as a moderate liberal,
he fesses up to that.
I wonder whether when we scratch a favoritist, you know, we don't find someone with a greater allegiance to fairness. Because if I had to restate your argument overall, I think I would say favoritism, except where it's unfair, really is the argument of your book, right? Because, you know, you're against gender discrimination, you're against racial discrimination. You concede that we have certain basic obligations toward all human beings, you know, not to kill them, not to enslave them, you know, not to abuse them in any way. So one might say that what you do in your book, and this is very useful, I agree, is to stress the extent to which human life, in fact, you know, derives its meaningfulness from a whole network of allegiances, which could be described as favoritism, you know, towards one's family, one's community, one's country, and so on. But of course, one can accept that and still recognize that there's a tension, right, between favoritism and justice, if you like, and that one can't resolve that tension by, you know, coming out on the side of favoritism.
Okay, Stephen, before you get in, Joseph Heath wants in too.
Yeah, I actually was going to use the same phrase, and I think his bark is a bit worse than his bite, in that he wants to defend a type of partiality and a certain tribalism, but he's not like a red meat tribalism, right? I mean, the way we've got to where we are today, there's a series of three sort of major developments that have made us more, say, impartial and egalitarian. I mean, so the first thing is, you know, what we call the axial age, the development of the major world religions and philosophies. They sort of coincide with the rise of the state. So there you get the first kind of blow against genuine tribalism, in the sense that you get, say, the Christian notion that everyone has equal moral status, as opposed to the people down the road being just like not human. So you expand the moral community to include everybody. So then you have, with the Enlightenment, the development of you know, the modern nation state, then an extension of that to political equality. So it's not just, oh yeah, everyone's a human being, but that everyone actually has equal standing before courts and so forth, right? So that's when you get the development of political equality. And then you had, in the 1960s, another huge movement pushing towards equality and impartiality in our society, which tried to level status inequalities. So you had equal, you know, elimination of gender discrimination, racial discrimination, and so on. Now, Stephen is not taking issue with either the first or the second. So it's not just that he grants the moral equality of everyone and moral impartiality. but that he also wants there to be fairness in the legal system. So he's not saying the judges should be partial or that the state should violate partiality or be tribal or whatever, right? He's entirely talking about what happens in a kind of informal social sphere. And a lot of the examples that he has that are compelling are actually a rejection of what I think of as sort of 1960s excesses.
So you okay with this then?
So I agree with him about the 1960s excesses, but I think that, that nothing like huge hinges on that. I mean, the really important things are the legal equality. I mean, that, and the arguments for fairness, and also like the big movements towards impartiality, like equal status for women and visible minorities and so on. I mean, that's driven by court decisions and the politics of what the law is going to be, and it has social consequences, but it's not driven by the informal social thing. So, like, the fact that in grade 2 your teacher is being ridiculously non-judgmental about the children is, I don't think, a high-stakes social issue.
Sylvia.
But I think, to go back to Joe's point about these various historical periods, that if we look at the 1960s and we ask ourselves, what did the social movements that came out of civil rights and women's rights and environmentalism and so on, what were they arguing for? In many cases, they were arguing for a breaking down between exactly what Stephen talks about, which is the institutional realm, where he favors impartiality, and the personal realm, where he favors partiality. But the point is, there's a great deal of seepage. I'm not, unlike Jordan's depiction of us as political theorists, I'm an empirical scholar. I study the here and now. And I would argue that a great deal of the challenges that continue to face those movements in their current periods is the inability of us to have laws and court decisions and so on that affect the inequalities in the private realm. So, for example, we can have all kinds of rules, for example, about the labor market, but that doesn't necessarily affect unequal divisions of power, authority, and labor in the private home. Right, so I think it's again it's an opportunity for political theorists to talk about these divisions, but it's very difficult for citizens living in democratic systems, for example, to imagine that there is such a watertight boundary or silo between the impartiality that he would like to see in institutions and the partiality which he wants to see in terms of solidarity and compassion and generosity, outside institutions in the private home, because the family is an institution.
Let me get Stephen and then Jordan to respond.
Yeah, okay, so you guys are piling up, so let me see which ones let's see if I can make my bite equal my bark a little. Starting with the last point, I think I agree, and I try to also raise this in the book, that this issue has been solved sort of neatly and cleanly by many thinkers by making a sort of obvious divide between the personal self and the public self. And we say, well, in the personal world you can engage in all kinds of favoritism, but the public self must engage in this neutrality and, kind of Nemo-centric view of ethics, the view from nowhere in which everyone is equal. And I argue that there is no clear dividing line between the personal and the public, and that makes things much more complicated. I also think that I take the point about the proximity issue, like we're closer to our family and therefore the good we do can be seen and understood and known better than, say, giving money to starving Africans, which is more remote. I'm trying to make a stronger argument than that, though, which is that we actually have a greater ethical duty to our loved ones and our family. It's not just a pragmatic problem of not knowing where our money's going to go and that we don't know whether the help is going to get there. I actually think we owe more to our family, and therefore, when there's any kind of competition between those two demands, the family should always trump the distant needs, even if they're dramatic needs of strangers. So in that sense, I think I'm making a stronger argument than just the proximity one. As for the history of liberal progress, I think that's very helpful, and I think I would agree with some of that. I do end up in a place where many liberals end up. I'm obviously pro-communitarian, but I try to make this additional argument that the reason why we're so devoted to our communities is not just because of a common language, let's say, or maybe a common ethnicity. My argument is it's these affective bonds or emotional ties that we have with others. That's the grounding principle for good tribalism, if I can, make that claim. And that's the kind of thing that we need to celebrate more and investigate more.
Okay, Jordan, come on in.
Well, I'd also like to bring up another issue with regards to whether what you're doing with your child is precisely favoritism, because I think that your role as a parent is to act as a reasonable proxy for the actual world. And though I have a son, and I'm pretty happy about him and all that, I don't think the way that I treated him when he grew up could precisely be characterized as favoritism. And to buttress that point, I had a person come and talk to me the other day, because I'm a clinical psychologist, and this person wants to see me, and he was very distressed that he was continually shown unfair and fairness, so to speak, by his parents, because they were continually engaging in activities that were bordering on nepotism and handing him things that he didn't believe he deserved. And he felt that they had stolen his destiny from him and made it unable for him to compete properly in the real world. And so he was treated in a way that you might regard as with favoritism, but that wasn't an appropriate parent-child relationship. So the fact that I take care of my children doesn't necessarily mean that I'm showing them favoritism. So, and that's another reason why it's so necessary to be careful about words like what fairness and favoritism and so on actually mean in the situation.
That's a good point. Stephen, you want to speak to that distinction?
Yeah, I agree with him. I think that's a great point. I try to make the claim in the book that if you turn to the Chinese case, which I'm holding up in this one little area as sort of inspiring, it being the firstborn son, let's say, is really a combination of privileges and tremendous responsibilities. Mm-hmm. So I'm trying to use a more critical notion of favoritism here that would include the kinds of things that he was discussing. I would not want to spoil my child so that he was ill-prepared to handle the world. Quite the opposite. I would want to make him tough enough to handle the world. But my point is simply that let's imagine a scenario where you've got a limited number of seats to get into a school, and there's a great deal of competition. Am I going to do whatever it takes to try to get a position for my son in this school? You bet I am. I'm going to do whatever it takes so that he has the best opportunities.
You would do everything you could to prepare him to compete fairly for that position, but my suspicions are great that you wouldn't do anything that would transgress more or less utilitarian ethics in order to give him an unfair advantage.
You may not know him that well.
Well, I mean, I've heard, maybe
he's already said, Jordan, he'd be prepared to kill for the kid. You don't think he'd be prepared to cut the line?
He said he had an impulse in that direction, which isn't precisely the same thing.
No, okay. Joseph, come on in.
Well, I just want to say, it's pretty easy to come up with examples of good partiality that we endorse and also bad partiality. And I mean, so, there are lots of people who genuinely love their sons more than their daughters. And there are a lot of cultures that promote that, right? And it's affectively grounded, right? That is that people, when they see the daughter, they're disappointed, and they never overcome that disappointment, right? And it's a huge obstacle that women face. So we would incline to say, oh, that's bad partiality. I'm not sure what ground Stephen has for saying that, but the question I want to ask is whether or not it's possible to have good partiality without bad partiality. In other words, whether or not it's a package, or whether or not it's possible to slice the two apart, so that we can have happy partiality where it's all just about love and it's never about hate. And my major reason for objecting to a lot of the specific things that Stephen's recommending is I think that they're a package, and that therefore the reason we go for fairness is because we're settling, right? Rather than having the mixed package of love and hate, we decide to just go with fairness because we're just happier not going there.
Got it. Stephen?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great point. I would say that there's a long-standing assumption. Some of it is corroborated by empirical psychology, but there's been new data to show that the longstanding assumptions are not quite right, and that is that to have an in-group is automatically to have out-groups. In other words, in order for us to have an us, there must be a them, and for us to have greater social solidarity, we must be opposed to some kind of enemy, and that xenophobia is somehow inevitable. I think that's been something we've been accepting since Freud, all the way until quite recent. I think that there's been more research recently to show that the childhood psychology and developmental psychology is more complicated than that. And they've done experiments on kids that show that, yes, it's true that we tend to identify with an in-group automatically at a very, very early age, and that can be based on fairly arbitrary things like skin color, even just what color shirt you're wearing. But the outgroups are not automatically thought of as enemies or in pejorative negative terms if the experiment is set up such that kids can apply neutral terms to them. So originally when they asked this, they held up dolls that were the same color as the subject and dolls that were a different color, and then they gave the child a choice, a false dichotomy. You have good positive terms and then negative terms, and the child would apply negative terms to the outgroup. What they've done more recently is offer a larger buffet of terms, some of which are neutral, some are positive, and some are negative. In point of fact, little kids will identify in-group with positive terms, but frequently they'll identify outgroups with neutral and other positive terms, not automatically negative. So the experiment was actually giving us data that was not as reliable. So I think that's partly at issue here.
Clifford and then Sylvia.
I don't want to go so far as to say that those experiments in the lab don't prove a damn thing, but I am going to say that the notion that the firmest basis of friendship is a common enemy doesn't just go back to Freud, it goes back to classical political thought, right? It's a staple of classical political thought. And it's true. In the real world, in-groups and out-groups compete for scarce resources, right? And therefore, it's a choice. It's us or them. And the question becomes, how far do we prosecute our interest at the expense of theirs? Is there any universal standard limiting us from prosecuting our interest, whether individually or collectively, at the expense of theirs? I mean, that's the problem in the real world. And therefore, I don't think you can resolve it by saying that allegiance to an in-group doesn't necessarily involve harboring negative feelings toward members of an out-group.
Let's get Sylvia to follow up.
If I can just pick up on Cliff's point, I mean, I think one of the limitations of the experimental laboratory is that we don't have political leaders. We don't have the tyrants who often incite what I would call the slippery slope from favoritism, bias, nepotism, as it's in this happy, loving family, all the way down to some notions of prejudice, hatred, and potentially much worse. So I think the exploitation of those in-group, out-group dynamics is not something that tends to unfold so much on an individual level with huge human consequences as it does on a collective level when we have, whether we're going to talk about authoritarian personality leaders or we're going to talk about the power of the crowd in totalitarian systems. But I think it's a lot more complicated than small children in a laboratory growing up in a liberal democratic society being shown dolls of different varieties. I think we have to look at the cases where we have seen genocide in our times and ask ourselves, to what extent was this all about individuals and defective families, maybe, where people didn't love each other enough, and to what extent did it have other origins?
Okay, I know others want to get in on this, but we're running out of time and I want to hear from Zell Kravinsky. Stephen mentions this guy in his book, Zell Kravinsky, who, in the name of fairness, has given $45 million to charities and a kidney, which is above and beyond the call of duty, particularly since he gave the kidney to a total stranger. Let's play the clip, then we'll come back and chat. Roll tape, please.
I'm not presenting myself as any kind of exemplar of the philanthropic life or the ethical existence. Oddly enough, I seem to have arrived at precisely the same positions that utilitarians hold by what I consider common sense and what I call a characterological inclination. And it's this characterological inclination that makes me charitable. What that element of my character is a distaste for waste. I don't like waste. I can't stand, especially money, when money is wasted, and everything is translatable into money. Money is the fungible medium of our existence these days. So when I say waste of money, I mean waste of anything. And for that reason, I always lived very, very simply, very cheaply. Always lived for less than $10,000 a year, even when I started to make a lot more than $10,000 a year.
Clifford, I want to go to you. You know this guy, right? Or you've written about him anyway.
I've written a chapter about him in my book on compassion, which is not yet completed and therefore has not yet appeared.
Okay. Having said that, what do you think about the motives that he articulated at the end there?
Well, he's given many different explanations for his behavior.
Well, waste is one of them.
Of which this is perhaps the least interesting.
Gee, thanks, Cliff.
I don't deny that Mr. Kravinsky abhors waste. Yeah. But he's given much more ambitious arguments about especially his decision to give away the kidney, which are much closer, I would say, to the issues that we're discussing in this program, having to do with the fundamental obligations that we have to other human beings as such, and the basis in compassion, as he often discusses it, for some such obligation. So he's a very interesting case, and he aroused a lot of hostility. His wife was not happy with his decision to donate the kidney. His parents, who were veteran communists, were not happy with his decision to donate the kidney. And there's a lot of question as to whether he's adequately fulfilled his obligations to his children, given that he has chosen to give away the vast majority of his wealth to strangers rather than to bequeath it to his children. So he poses the problems that Stephen discusses, I think, in quite a radical way.
This is not a guy who's going to kill for his kid, is he? Unlike Stephen in Chicago.
No, certainly not.
Yeah, we can see that. What do you make of this argument that he abhors waste and therefore he's done what he's done?
Yeah, well, when I hear something like that, especially in combination with some fairly extreme behavior, then the clinical psychologist in me sort of kicks in. And orderly people, if they're really orderly, first of all, they tend to be somewhat miserly. They hate waste, but they also have this tendency to reduce the complexity of the world to a single ordering principle. And there's a real totalitarian impulse in that. And we know that orderliness is associated with totalitarianism and various other pathological frames of thinking. And I think the problem with rational philosophy of the type that the kidney donator espouses is that you can reduce the complexity of the world to a single principle and then act on that principle, but you're doing tremendous damage to the full range of facts. It's a form of intellectual game, and it's a game that really rapidly turns into a nightmare. To handle the world properly, you have to handle it with a balance of principles, and those principles have to be allowed to compete for primacy given the particularities of the situation. And you can't just do the sort of thinking that he's talking about without damage. I'll give you an example. Hitler used utilitarian arguments to occupy Eastern Europe. He said, well, it doesn't matter if we have to kill 7 million Eastern Europeans as long as we can replace them over a few decades with 100 million Germans. That's the greatest good for the greatest number. So he was willing to sacrifice something that was of value, but he felt that the ultimate end point was more appropriate. And I see something like that operating here. It's like, what about the rest of his organs? He
has considered donating them all.
Well,
all?
Yes.
At some point, you think
while he's alive.
He's fantasized about that.
Right,
yes.
Right. Well, and for me, there's something bordering on pathological about that.
Joe?
I just want to say the formulation of abhorring waste is actually just a negative way of formulating the utilitarian injunction, right? To maximize happiness. So to the extent that he's using his resources in a way that doesn't maximize happiness, he's wasting them. So what he said was actually just he's a utilitarian. And so I just wanted to sort of, in defense of philosophers, I have to say, so we have a perfect term for what he does. It's called supererogatory. Sounds vulgar, but it just means above and beyond the call of duty. And most people would classify him as a type of moral saint, a secular moral saint instead of a religious saint. But he's clearly exceeding his obligations. Yes. I unlike Jordan, I'm not unhappy with the fact that he's doing it.
You're not related to him.
Very few people think that morality requires that, with one exception, which is that utilitarianism seems to actually require that as an obligation. But I have to say that 30, 40 years that philosophers have been arguing about this specific issue, that's always taken as being like a downside of utilitarianism, that it generates this absurd conclusion that we should all be doing exactly what this guy was doing. And so, I mean, in philosophy, we take that as being a problem for the theory. It's not like we're all standing around saying, oh yeah, we all have to be massively impartial like this and so on.
Okay.
So I mean, we're not crazy, right?
In our remaining moments here, I want to, if I can, bring a story to the table here and get you to comment on it. And this story goes back, I guess, a little over a month ago when we took this program on the road to Peterborough, Ontario, a couple of hours away from here. And we did a program, we did a discussion about educating Aboriginal Canadians and how well or badly we were doing at that. And after the discussion was over, we opened it up to questions from the audience, and people lined up at the microphone and they asked their questions. Fine. Program's over. An Aboriginal woman came up to me afterwards and said, "Your program was racist." And I said, "What do you mean?" And she said, "Well, you ask people to come and line up at a microphone, it favors the white people." And I asked, "How?" And she said, "Because in our culture, we don't leap for the microphone, we don't leap for the megaphone, we sit back and we think. And by the time we are ready to ask our question or offer our opinion, time's up, and we get the short end of the stick. And that's a problem for you and your racist broadcast, and you need to do something about it. Must confess, hadn't thought about this before, certainly not in that way, but she raises an issue. And let's just go around on this. Stephen, in fairness, do we have to create new rules in this multicultural world in which we're all trying to respect each other's customs and mores? Do we have to create new and different rules for some groups out of fairness to them?
Well, I see the need for trying to understand different cultural backgrounds. It sounds a little bit like she's essentializing Aboriginal people so that they all don't go up to the microphone and feel comfortable speaking in public. This strikes me as dubious. But in any case, if it is the case that she's offended, we're going to be in trouble if our notion of the right thing to do is such that we've made sure no one is offended. Just because you're offended by something doesn't mean you have a moral claim on the show or the society. You've got to make a better case. I think in that case, there are alternative ways in which those voices could be heard, maybe through online chat afterwards, or there could be some kind of system whereby people were encouraged more towards the mic. I'm fine with that. But the assumption that you've got to fix it if someone's offended is very much a product of our fairness culture, and I'm suspicious of it.
Well, Sylvia, that's what she said. I said, so what do you want me to do about it? And she said, I don't know, that's your problem, you fix it. But clearly, our white culture favored those, she alleged, who are prepared to leap to the microphone first and did not favor, or punished in some respects, was unfair to Indigenous Canadians who she says don't work that way. She got a point?
I think so. I mean, I think in terms of university discussions, when I was responsible for an Aboriginal Studies program at the University of Toronto, we did have a very strong emphasis on trying to have meetings, for example, in a more consensus-based environment around a round table, for example, and we tried to have less of the zero-sum, winner-take-all, cut out the floor from under your opponent kind of discussion that we see, for example, in our parliamentary debates, where it was more about reaching some agreement about what the core questions were and what the process was we were going to pursue to try and resolve them, and perhaps a different kind of format might work in the future in that context.
I suggested to her, I said, well, so would an idea be we reserve the first 5 minutes for questions from Indigenous Canadians? And she said, yeah, that's not a bad idea. And then I said, well, what if none come forward in the first 5 minutes? I mean, in my culture, dead air is not a good thing. We didn't come to a resolution. Clifford, what do we do about this?
I think the story simply shows that you don't solve any problems by invoking fairness. The fact is, fairness can't mean treating every human being, whether white or Aboriginal or by extrapolation Martian, if that person thinks that he or she deserves to be treated, right? Because there's such a strong human proclivity to exaggerate our deserts and therefore to minimize the deserts of others when they come into competition with our own. So whatever fairness means, it can't possibly mean that.
Joe, what does it mean in this circumstance?
Yeah, I mean, I think she was trolling you a little bit there.
No, I meant her. She wasn't. She meant it.
She was that serious. Well, I mean, with all of these things, I mean, it gets complicated. There's a useful distinction in American civil rights law between disparate treatment, disparate impact. You can't, and so, you have rules which can treat people differently, or they could treat everyone the same, but it could have a differential impact on people. And it's sort of widely understood that you really can't be serious about neutralizing disparate impact of rules. Like shy people are also discriminated against by open mics.
Jordan, want to take the last 30 on this?
Well, I think that comment illustrates the validity of one of Dr. Asma's original points, which is that people can use arguments about fairness to push their own relatively unsavory agenda. And to me, it just sounds like she was looking for something to be offended about. She had no solutions, and she also had no evidence whatsoever to buttress her claim. Like, she's making a pretty radical claim about a cultural group that is by no means homogenous.
She did make us all think twice about this issue, though, which we'd never thought about before.
There's lots of Native American groups, and the probability that all of them act on a consensus basis in a consistent manner that's dramatically unlike that of all the different subtypes of Caucasian culture strikes me as highly improbable.
You get the last word. And we thank Stephen Asma for being there on the line from Chicago, Illinois for us. Thank you very much for joining us tonight, Stephen. We've really appreciated your participation in our program. Also thanks to Sylvia Beshevkin and Joseph Heath and Clifford Orwin and Jordan Peterson, the pride of the U of T, here at our table at Yonge and Eglinton.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.